question. I see that we have a question from Fantasy from earlier. If our other speakers want to turn their cameras on.
Okay, yeah, I see the first question. And yeah, that's a really, really good question. It's definitely a packed question, so I just want to like dissect it here.
I can read it first if that works.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, so do you have suggestions for folks who may knowingly or unknowingly interact or try to communicate with someone who is deaf or hard of hearing while wearing a mask? For example, being farther apart and pulling down our mask. Do you feel comfortable sharing that you need to read lips when you interact with them, or do you feel like avoiding it is best for you?
Yeah, so to address the first part of the question, it's really hard because normally, you know, when it comes to people's health and safety and then my ability to participate in conversation, obviously health and safety comes first. So I do not feel comfortable asking people to take their mask down because of me. So that is definitely a hard thing because I've never been afraid to ask people for what I need and how to make my life easier. So this is definitely a new thing where all of a sudden now there is something out there that's more important than my accommodations. And so yeah, it's a hard thing with the mask. Definitely maybe going further apart, 6 feet apart, and then taking the mask down, that can definitely be helpful. Writing down is always my best bet. I have my notes app always on my phone, and I get, like, after the second or third time that someone repeats themselves, and I just know it's a lost cause, I get my notes app out and they write down what they're going to tell me. Obviously, that is a longer process, but again, like, it is what's necessary sometimes, and if you do have the patience and compassion, then I know that whoever it is that you are with that's hearing impaired or deaf will really appreciate that. So yeah, I definitely suggest just getting your phone out or a pen and paper to write down what you're saying. That will also ensure that there's no miscommunication. Let's see, do I feel comfortable sharing that I need to read lips yes, I definitely always feel comfortable. As I kind of said before, that although it can feel very vulnerable or that like you're oversharing when you explain what you need or your story, in the end, it benefits you. It's almost a selfish thing. If you share what you need as somebody with a disability, that person can meet you halfway and also make the effort, and you're not working 10 times harder. Because it is exhausting sometimes having a disability, just in the sense that there's this added, you have to function at a level that society expects you to function at, which is this normalized, what they think is normal. And so it is hard. So when there are people that make that extra effort and meet you halfway, it's greatly appreciated. So yeah, I definitely feel comfortable, but of course there are people that don't, and I have encountered plenty of people that don't, and there is nothing wrong with that. It just means that they're at a different place in their journey and they identify differently. There's lots of reasons why. The point is we don't know, but I would say in that situation, there is only so much you can do. You can educate yourself, but that person will gladly receive help only if they allow you to. So there are sort of limits when it comes to that. But yeah, that's my answer to the question.
Thank you for sharing your insight on that, Giselle. Another question that we have in the chat: how do we combat ableism in institutions such as education, K through 12 and higher, police, criminal justice, careers, medical/healthcare system, etc.? How have you done this?
I'll start, and I'm happy to also share with the other panelists and see what others think as well. But particularly in the K through 12 and higher ed system, I think one of the things that people forget, and I just want to make it overtly clear, is that the Americans with Disabilities Act is a law. This is not a suggestion. This is not something that we are asking you if you want to do. It is something where if you receive federal funding, you need to comply with. And I think what a lot of people don't also realize is that there are different titles of the ADA that are relevant to employment, but also education. And so I think part of that process is being able to arm yourself or arm ourselves with the information that's already laid out in these federal guidelines and being able to use those in conversation. Now, we have to add in that other layer of the fact that like doing this is going to cause friction or it could cause friction and does innately have a power structure. And so I think engaging with people who have had these conversations, people who can support you in having these conversations, whether it be allies on campus or external allies, is super important. For example, knowing that like asking for time off, depending on how it's phrased, if it's a disability related reason for employment, there are ways in which that can happen, especially for things that need to happen related to your care. But there needs to be ways in which we have these conversations, and we can do a lot better job at supporting individuals with disabilities across all domains. I'm really interested in that social piece about police and the criminal justice system, because we know that people with disabilities are one of the groups that can be harmed, to keep it neutral, harmed by the criminal justice system in many different ways. And I'm not sure, I don't know that I see a solution, maybe because right now I'm feeling a bit exhausted in terms of where we are in our country, but I'm interested to hear what the other panelists think about that piece.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that you said, Jose. But I think also I think this can connect as well as to the next question about how can USD do better, but institutions as a whole, I think need to address ableism in a social model, and that means through the social model in that the system is the issue, not the individual. Someone with a disability is not the issue. Their ability is not the problem, or it's the system that causes the inaccessibility. It's the stairs. It's not having ramps. It's not having elevators. It's not having systems of teaching that understands people learn differently. It's like systems that, like in what I face, that criminalize or punish students for acting different or learning different rather than acknowledging why are they learning different. You know, what am I doing as a teacher that's not meeting their needs? So I think that's the first step, is acknowledging our systems that oppress and are ableist and not putting all of it on individuals. But then I think there's also a step that's once you've acknowledged that, what are the systems and institutions doing to combat that? And specifically for USD, I think that can be having more educational, like having classes that educate and talk about ableism or disability justice, or even having classes in high school so college is not your first experience with these conversations, as well as having every building be accessible, having your offering accommodations and that support to freshmen before they even come, having that easily accessible to new students that are looking at the school. I know that all the weight of finding my accommodations, of making sure my school will meet my needs, was put on me. So I think that needs to be from the jump. The school needs to do better at that. So yeah, I think that it's both acknowledging and recognizing how we see the systems at play, but also how we critically take steps to combat those systems and address the needs of the disabled community.
Great, thank you all for sharing on that question. So have you ever thought of becoming a lawyer or a disability rights lawyer / advocate in some way?
I'm smiling because if I didn't go to PhD school, I was going to go to law school. And my decision came from wanting to be in the experience with other people and support the individual through navigating systems and not wanting to feel like in focusing on the system, I was losing touch with the individual. That one-on-one interaction, that experience with connecting with people was what led me to psychology rather than law school.
Okay, I'll go. So I would say this actually ties into the next question as well, my answer. But in terms of becoming a disabilities rights lawyer and advocate, and then my answer also ties into the balance between treating someone as an individual and understanding their identity. I definitely have struggled with a long time. I've had different phases in my life where, one, I'm ashamed of my disability, obviously when I was younger. Then I had the phase where like I felt so empowered and comfortable, but then it was all I was talking about. And I would bring it up in every conversation because it defined me not in a good way, in a way that like they're sort of what Jose was talking about, how it's just a part of me instead of all of me. So I've had these phases where it was not at all who I was, and then it was everything who I was. And now I feel like I've kind of gotten to a place where I can balance it, where it comes up sometimes, but now it's not so much of a huge defining factor, although of course it is something I'm clearly open about and very proud of. But I would say becoming a disabilities rights lawyer and an advocate, I've already am so open about it in my world and with my friends that pursuing a career as well, and of course this is so personal and not having to do with anybody else, but pursuing a career like that would probably be too much, just because there's so many other things I'm passionate and interested about as well. But since for the second question of the balance between treating someone as an individual and still understanding their identity, to sort of touch on what I had said before, I have had instances with friends where of course they're supportive and accepting, but there's definitely a difference between a friend looking past your disability and a friend knowing about your disability and loving you even more because of it. And I think that really is my answer to that question, because you can understand their identity and their disability and do what you need to do to be supportive. But my true best friends see that I'm a much better listener because of it. And the qualities that I have because of being deaf make me a friend they would want even more so than everybody else. And so that's where I know that they're really treating me as an individual and not just being so focused on my identity.
Real quick, if I can answer the previous question about going into law, specifically around disability justice and rights. I think that I am still a third year and my major is sociology. So it is something that I am passionate about and I'm thinking about going into law school, because I think in my classes and as in the orgs that I'm involved with, that I learn even more and more the ways that disability rights and the ADA is not met. Like said before, it's a law, it's not a question. It is just as you cannot park in an accessible spot if you do not have a placard, which is often ignored or like not met because in our society, we don't see that as like important unless it impacts us directly. So something like that, or even like the fact that people with disabilities can and have been, and to this day are not paid minimum wage, and that is okay. And I think it's things like this that you don't need to know, or you don't have to know if you have the privilege of not having to face that, or even if you don't hold that identity, that I think through a lawyer lens, I can create change in that way. And I think that it's not the only way to create change, but I think there is legal rights that are not being met that shouldn't even be a question. And so I think we can talk about the interaction through friends and groups and communities and those issues that people face every day, but also we need to address the legal rights, the basic rights, the human rights that are not being met to this day. And so I think that's something I'm passionate about and definitely want to go to, but also at the same time recognizing that having dyslexia, having ADHD, there's still issues that I face even with certain tests and exams to become a lawyer. They don't want to or think that they should offer accommodations such as extended time because of many other reasons, but I have to think about what accommodations I need that would not be met to go down that field. And so those are things that I've been sitting with a lot now that I'm a junior and going into my senior year. But yeah, I think that it's something I'm very passionate about, but also have to think about how that system is still inaccessible to me too.
Jumping in really quick, first of all, I want to acknowledge something you said about graduate school and the system just not being built for people like us, and acknowledging that I've experienced that in many ways. When I first started grad school, they said to me, "You're the first person with a wheelchair that we've had here in 7 years, so we're not sure how to do this." And I mean, they were really supportive and but it had to be a trial and error. And I think in so many ways, from exams to classes to the material being taught, there are so many systems of privilege and oppression that are just being perpetuated. But I do want to acknowledge that that's why we should be in these systems, to disrupt them. Just going to throw that out there. And the second thing I just want to throw out there about balancing identity versus understanding one's identity versus understanding the person as a whole. Also ask. I mean, the person will tell you what's a relevant piece of their experience in that moment. Same thing with helping, right? If you want to figure out how a person wants to be helped, ask, and then respect what they share with you. A person with a disability is still a person who can communicate with you where their own boundaries are.
Thank you all. And for this next question, I just want to read the thank you note as well. Wow, I am blown away. Sorry, just moved. Thank you all so much for your time and willingness to tell your stories. And then the question portion, do you have an example of how students, especially at USD, can advocate and accommodate for hidden invisible disabilities in some day-to-day interactions? Also, if you could maybe touch on some initiatives that are in need of active advocacy from able-bodied individuals.
I'll say for me, in my experience, having an invisible disability, I know some of my accommodations, I don't mind sharing, are like in having a note taker, having extended time. And I think that one thing that for me in my interactions day to day, I'll have students in class, for example, be like, "Oh, why aren't you ever here when we take exams?" Or "Did you miss the exam?" Or if I have use of calculator in my classes, and they'll say, "How are you allowed to do that? That's not fair." Or even "That's cheating." Or I've gotten students say like, "I wish I could do that." Stuff like that. I think that's not okay, and I think that stems from an ableist mindset, as well as I think oftentimes even professors can be very ableist as well, in the way I personally haven't had that experience, but I've had people I know share instances where professors disclose students with the disability or students who have the accommodation, and that's also not okay. I know that the DLDRC tries to work with professors as well as with the students to make sure that that person's identity is, protected, but it also, I think there's something either in the training or in that communication that's lost, that I think sometimes professors do not have the adequate training to know exactly what they're supposed to be doing. And I think that's something USD needs to work on, and the DLDRC specifically. But I do know that orgs like Alliance of Disability Advocates tries to work with students to make sure they know their rights and what they can ask for, what they should, how they should be treated in their class and such, as well as hosting events like this with other orgs to have them share their share their story, share their experience, and educate people. Another thing I would say about invisible disabilities, one thing I face all the time is I depend on others. You know, I depend on my students to be a note taker. So if people don't sign up to be a note taker, I'm like begging the professor, can you send out another email? Can you ask someone to do it? Can, you know, and oftentimes people just don't sign up unless it's worded as, well, you're going to get paid for it. Well, you're already taking notes anyway, so why don't you get paid for it? You know, and I think it shouldn't end in that way. It shouldn't take to that measure for people to want to do it. But I do want to say, I think if you are in a class and someone needs a note taker, that please step up and use your privilege from the get-go, you know? But yeah.
Yeah, I would also I will be the first to admit that I am not that educated about disabilities studies in general as a whole. But I can say just from my own experience, in terms of how you can advocate and help, I would say leading by example is a huge thing, just because the only reason why I'm so good at speaking for myself and advocating for myself is because my mother did that for me when I was a child. And I'm very privileged that way. But my mother was a warrior. Like the IEPs and making sure that I got everything that I need, it's all literally because of her. Nobody else deserves the credit. But because I watched her growing up, now as an adult, I literally just imitate her. I say and do everything she did when I was a child. So that's the only reason why I have these insights. It's just because I watched her. So as friends, as professors, as anybody in any type of institution, especially when it's not the people, but the systems that are a problem, as Sarah had said, it's really just about modeling it, and you advocating and doing will teach other people. You using the right terminology will teach other people. Your own insights will give other people, pave the path for other people to behave that way as well. And I think that can be applied to a lot more than just disabilities. But that's my personal experience.
One piece that hasn't been touched on is that social part of like being in college and being at a university and wanting to hang out with your peers and like experience the same things. And one of the things that I will share is that we should already be planning events and planning activities that are universally designed so that everyone can participate. Similar to this event where we have interpreters and captioning, we should really be thinking ahead and just assuming that these things are common practice. And that is the way in which we tell people, you are welcomed in this space. You are welcomed and you are one of us, and we are together. And then if I can jump to the next question about disability videos and like recommendations. I think that's the next question.
Go for it.
Yeah, cool. There's an awesome TED Talk by Stella Young called I'm Not Your Inspiration, Thank You. And this person talks about what it's like to live with a disability and be praised for something that isn't what we should be praised for. So.
I would also add, I think that I don't have a list of books and recommendations right now, but that is something I think we can get out to everyone who attends. There's definitely a lot of, well, not a lot, but there are resources to educate yourself in movies, TV shows, books that speak on these. And I think it's also important to note who's telling that story, who's sharing and representing that identity. Is it someone from the community? So I think when we do look for those sources of media, that we be conscious of who's holding that identity, because I know it's become even more, I think, talked about in society, especially in a lot of TV shows, is people like who don't hold that identity, who don't have that disability, acting or representing as someone with that. And oftentimes they're taking a job from someone who has that identity. So I think it is really important to be conscious of not only getting that diversity in your media, but also recognizing who is creating it, who's acting in it, who's writing it, who's telling the story.
Thank you. So our next question, how does language play a part in the perpetuation of ableism, and how can we work to go against that by using inclusive terminology? What terminology do you personally feel comfortable expressing yourself as?
I know that for me, I want people to refer to me as a person with a disability, putting that person first because I am a person before any of my identities. I know that I can refer to myself, and I choose to use the label disabled because disability, even though it's made to feel like a bad word, is actually a historical word. And I feel like when I use that word, I'm connected to generations of advocates who have been fighting for civil liberties, and I refuse to be made to feel like it's a word I shouldn't be using because society tells me I shouldn't. So that's my take on language.
I can go next. I would say yes, to go off of that too with the word disability. It's I had mentioned this, I think, but it's so interesting for me too because I can't even like give a right explanation. But like if somebody were to tell me like you have a disability, I'm like, yes, that's the truth. But if someone tells me you're disabled, something about that just rubs me really, really wrong. And I think it obviously has to do with the connotation of it, and it suggests that I am lesser than, or something is set like holding me back so I can't function or perform the way that everybody else does. So it's fragile. Words are fragile because like I literally said the same word but just a different form of it, and it changes the whole meaning. So it is important to stay educated on that. In terms of what I definitely identify as deaf, but that in itself is very controversial as well because of with people with cochlear implants, this is a very complicated thing, and so I don't want to speak too much about it or say the wrong thing, but a lot of times the deaf community, because it's infused with deaf culture and with sign language, if I'm infused in the hearing culture, even though medically and physically I'm completely deaf, calling myself deaf means that I'm also suggesting that I'm in the culture and language, which isn't necessarily true. But then on the flip side, if I say that I'm hearing, that's obviously not true either. So there was for a while, I had an identity crisis of not knowing what the hell to call myself because I was like, am I hearing, am I deaf? So that's why I finally came to the conclusion that I'm physically deaf but culturally hearing. Although now I am fluent in sign language and have become very involved in deaf culture. So now I can confidently say that I am deaf. But but that shows you that like there could be plenty of deaf people, but they all identify differently because of things like culture and so many other aspects. So the important thing to know when it comes to terminology is that every individual is different, and to never assume that some people want to be called certain things just because of what you see or assume or hear. So make sure to have that personal conversation, obviously, if it's appropriate and comfortable, because yeah, everybody's different. Every individual wants different things. Some people get bothered by disabled, some people get bothered by disability, some people don't mind both. Like, you know, some people want to get called a person before they get called the disability. As Jose was saying, everybody's different.
Okay, thank you all for sharing. Oh, Sarah, did you want to mention? Okay. Thank you all for sharing. The next question is, what is the biggest life lesson you have been taught through the experience of your identities?
I'm so sorry. Can you repeat the question one more time?
Yeah, of course. What is the biggest life lesson you have been taught through the experience of your identities?
For me, it's that difference isn't something that is scarier that should be shamed. Difference is something that should be celebrated because we all come at very different experiences. And that difference is more complex than people realize. No two people with a disability, for example, are going to have the same experience. And so we can only really speak to our own experiences. But one thing that I also find comfort in is that like these more basic human experiences of like joy, sorrow, grief, happiness, like these are things that we can all share. And so when somebody shares their experience of difference, even though it's very easy to write it off and say like, oh, I don't understand that, or it doesn't affect me, truly those emotions, that experience is something that we can all connect with if we really try to be actively listening and self-aware. And that's what my identities have taught me, is that we should really be listening to those experiences.
I would say for me, I think oftentimes, at least with my identity having dyslexia, a learning disability, oftentimes I was like called either stupid or lazy or whatever for my accommodations. But honestly, what I've learned, and the biggest life lesson that I've learned, is that we all just, specifically, I guess I can speak from my experience with dyslexia. It's not that I am dumb or that I can't learn to a certain capacity. It's just that I think and look at the world and learn differently. And so reminding myself that that can be an advantage in how I take on challenges, how I interact with people, how I interact with readings and lessons, I think helps me remember that there's no cap to my intellectual capability, that I can keep, I guess, challenging myself in my workload, in my involvement, in my educational career, I think, and also just reminding myself that there's been so many, some of our greatest thinkers in history had dyslexia, and oftentimes we don't highlight or acknowledge that identity that they hold. And so I think yeah, it was a life lesson that I learned when I it took a while when I was first diagnosed. It was definitely not something I knew about or that I viewed in that way. But once I did, that helped me become more confident and accepting and loving, I guess, to myself and my disability.
I would say for my I touched on it a little bit before when I was speaking, but really the hidden blessings that you don't really would assume or notice at first until you've lived with your identity or experience for a long time. And there were a lot of like gifts and blessings that I had realized about. And for like an example, even like in high school, not hearing the teacher, not hearing what was going on in class, when I would go home to do homework would take 5 hours long when it would take all my friends 2 hours long, because not only am I teaching myself what I didn't hear in class, but then also doing the work on top of it. And while that was absolute hell at the time, now that I'm in college and I do have the right accommodations, because I had to work so much harder in high school, I am now doing better than a lot of my peers because I know what it's like to have work ethic and to put in a lot of time. So all of a sudden, that was a blessing that I didn't even realize. And then another one too, a big life lesson, especially as well, is I would also argue that my disability has illuminated a lot of people in my life that I didn't need, or it showed, how would I articulate this well? I would just say there are a lot of people that don't have the patience, that are maybe more closed-minded, and I would not have known otherwise without having my disability. And so that was a lot of people that are not in my life that could have been. And now I'm surrounded by people who are so patient and so compassionate and so loving and so open-minded. And who knows, maybe I would never have those people in my life without my disability. So really, I think my biggest life lesson too is just, I now can't even imagine who I would be without this, and I could not have said that 5 years ago. The biggest lesson is that even when things seem like really dark or really horrible or really hard, there is always a light at the end of the tunnel without being too cheesy. And I think my experience really proves that.
Thank you. So we are going to continue with these last two questions and then give Jose and Sarah both an opportunity to speak on ADA as well as Phoenix Empowered if you would like. So for Giselle specifically, can you discuss the difference between the capital D and the lowercase d in the word deaf?
Yeah, absolutely. I should have actually, thank you to, I know it's anonymous, but thank you to whoever asked that question because it is important. And I should have said that when I was talking about deaf culture. But yeah, so with deaf, there's the D at the beginning of the word, and it can either be lowercase deaf or uppercase deaf. And the two are very, very different meanings. The lowercase deaf would be more so what I am, which is physically deaf, but not, the capital D basically references to the community that you're a part of and the culture that you're immersed in. Whereas the lowercase d is just specifically talking about the fact that you can't hear and not about the community and the culture and all of the good things that are a part of the deaf community. So that's the other thing too for a lot of deaf people. They can sometimes struggle about whether they identify as a lowercase d deaf or uppercase d deaf. But I think that's an incredible tool, the lowercase and uppercase. It's an incredible tool to specify your identity and what community you're a part of. So yeah, I love that whoever asked that question.
Thank you. So we'll end with this last question prior to whatever socials or things you want to talk about. But this is a fun question, so thank you to whoever asked it. What is next for you all? What are some goals and dreams you have for yourself, either within these topics we have discussed or just personal passions beyond the disabilities you have?
I know for me, and I'll talk about this a bit when I talk about Phoenix Empowered, but for me, it's about taking as many stages as I can to share my story and disrupt as many systems thoughtfully as possible and just create space for thinking and empowerment, whatever that looks like.
I think for me, it's definitely continuing to pursue my education, but also bringing my sociological perspective into every circle I'm in. I think that with my minors in marketing and change making, I definitely want to set myself up to go into potentially the business world. But I think with also an emphasis of talking about identity, inclusion and diversity, talking about like intersectionality. And so that's kind of my goal. I don't have a set plan in mind for myself, but I do know that whatever I do, I'm definitely bringing these discussions into it.
I would say for me, in terms of my career path, I have no idea. So if anyone has any suggestions, let me know, because that's kind of having a crisis with what I want to do with my life. But of course, these discussions and keeping this discussion open and bringing it everywhere in my life is extremely important to me. I had just finished going abroad and doing traveling in semester at sea, and through travel, I think I've done a lot of self-exploration about my identity and my disability. And I think while that will always be a journey I'm on, I definitely have gotten a lot out of it. And I feel that now it's time, in terms of my next step, is getting to know other identities and learning about other people. Because I have sort of finally come to a good place with myself. So now I really, after college, I really hopefully, if things change, I really do hope to travel a lot and to immerse myself into different cultures and understand different stories and backgrounds. So I'm excited to see what adventures I go on after school. But yeah, that's my plan.
And really quickly, I definitely meant to do this in the beginning before I spoke, but I wanted to talk about Alliance of Disability Advocates. I think the Instagram was plugged in the chat on ADA at USD 19. But Alliance of Disability Advocates was founded 2 years ago by Fantasy Bias, one of our exec members. ADA is an Oregon campus consisting of students who are passionate about disability justice and creating tight-knit community between disabled students and allies. As an org, we strive to support and advocate and take action for all people. So please definitely stay tuned and stay involved with our Instagram to know what events and things that we are hosting, as well as disability justice work that we are doing on campus and in the community.
Thank you all for also giving me a chance to talk about the Phoenix Empowered. Very quickly, the Phoenix Empowered is a mental health organization that I founded to talk about things like identity, trauma, empowerment, and strength, using my story as a vehicle to have that conversation, but not the only vehicle. And so we do things like consultation, we do things like advertising and photo and video campaigns, and storytelling. Our biggest thing is that storytelling is what moves mountains. And so we are going to empower people who have historically been silenced to rise. And I'd love it if you joined us in that work. Thank you.
Thank you all. I just want to thank all of our speakers and one more time for Sarah, Giselle, and Jose for taking the time to share their stories and have this dialogue. I also want to thank both of our interpreters, Anna and Charlotte, as well as Susan for the closed captioning. And thank you all for attending, and we look forward to continuing this dialogue and this journey with you all.